Common Ground, a Prairie podcast, is supported by a generous grant from the North Dakota Natural Resources Trust. If you would like to contribute to our on-the-ground conservation initiatives and our conservation internship and mentorship programs here in North Dakota, please consider making a donation to us through our member support link on our Spotify page. Your contributions will directly support the Walsh County Three Rivers Soil Conservation District, where this year we will plant over 10,000 trees and several hundred acres of conservation grass, pollinators, and cover crops, while also offering hands-on conservation job training to our high school and college interns. You can also support our efforts by liking, reviewing, sharing, and subscribing to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. Thank you. Welcome to Common Ground, a Prairie podcast. This is episode 3, Thinking Like a Prairie. When was the last time you changed your mind? About something important, I mean. About something consequential. Something that changed the way you saw the world and your place in it. What had to happen for you to get there? How long did it take? That's the subject of today's episode. More specifically, we ask, how hard is it to change our minds in relation to land? To consider this question, we focus our attention on a famous story in conservation circles told by the most celebrated American conservationist of the 20th century, Aldo Leopold. In his best-known essay, Thinking Like a Mountain, Leopold claimed to have undergone a radical change of mind after he shot and killed a wolf, reaching her in time to witness, quote, the fierce green fire dying in her eyes. That moment is one of the best remembered in the life and works of Aldo Leopold. However, as my guest today will explain, the truth of that fateful, mind-changing moment is more complicated and perhaps more interesting than the essay, precisely because it reveals a deeper human story. Our guest today is Dr. Curt Meine, Senior Fellow of the Aldo Leopold Foundation and the Center for Humans and Nature. Dr. Meine published the first biography on Aldo Leopold and was the on-screen guide for the Emmy Award-winning documentary film Green Fire, Aldo Leopold and a Land Ethic for Our Time. During our conversation, we look back at Leopold's groundbreaking collection of essays, A Sand County Almanac, which has inspired countless conservationists since it was first published in 1949, a year after Leopold died of a heart attack while fighting a grass fire in Wisconsin, less than 100 yards from where the Aldo Leopold Legacy Center stands today. The year 2024 marks the 75th anniversary of A Sand County Almanac and the 100th anniversary of the Gila Wilderness, which Leopold helped designate as the world's first wilderness area that today is part of New Mexico's Gila National Forest. We spoke with Dr. Meine to discuss the 75th anniversary edition of A Sand County Almanac and to reflect upon its legacy today. We also pay tribute to those we've lost in 2024 after the recent deaths of two prominent figures, Estella Leopold Jr., the last of Aldo and Estella Leopold's children, and N. Scott Momaday, the Kiowa writer who became the first Native American author to win the Pulitzer Prize with Housemaid of Dawn in the late 1960s. Dr. Meine and I discuss the legacies of Momaday and Estella Leopold and share our own personal stories about how their work, alongside Leopold's essays, have shaped and continue to shape our understanding of what Leopold called the land ethic. As you listen to our conversation about how one of the most consequential figures in American conservation changed his mind about land, we invite you to consider the moments that have shaped and continue to shape your own relationships with land. We'd love to hear your stories. If you'd like to share, please comment on the episode on our YouTube channel or Spotify page, or email me at josh@walshcounty1938.com. Now, let's start the show.
This is one of those years that has come along where we get a chance to reflect a lot on the history, specifically of Aldo Leopold and his contributions to conservation, but more generally about the evolution of conservation more broadly. So, yeah, in 2024, we'll be marking first the 100th anniversary of Aldo Leopold's work to designate the Gila Wilderness area, a very large, expansive wild landscape in southwestern New Mexico. He worked on that when he was a young forester with the U.S. Forest Service, and it was a unprecedented, really, land protection effort. And it came early in his career. Later on, at the end of his career, he published his book that he's probably best known for in the conservation arena, his book, A Sand County Almanac. And that comes at the end of his career. So actually, it's also an opportunity to reflect on how Leopold grew and changed through those decades, and also how conservation evolved over that period.
To start with the book, what do you remember from your first experience or early experiences of reading Leopold and A Sand County Almanac and maybe some of his other writings? And then what stands out today when you think about your rereading of his work?
Yeah. So I first encountered Leopold's writing like so many other people. A friend of mine recommended that I read Leopold's Sand County Almanac. Actually gave me a copy. We were old high school buddies, and he came back from college out west to Chicago, where I was living at the time, and said, "Yeah, I think you'd like this book." And so I dipped into it. I'd read it. I'd heard of Leopold, I think, before, but had never sat down to read through the book that he became so well known for. And I've told this story a few times, but the honest truth is that the first time I read it, it didn't really resonate fully at that point. I was an English major, and I thought I knew what good literature was and what I liked and all that. I was very high on my own opinions of writing, I suppose, at that point. But once I began to explore the deeper layers of how we and more generally think of ourselves in the world, then those deeper layers of Leopold's writing began to touch me in new ways. So that first time, way back in college days, it was an introduction. I had no idea, of course, at that point that I'd be going on to devote a good portion of my career to studying Leopold and his concepts and how they work in the world now. That would come later on. But of course, the thing that grabs readers, and has since it was first published, was just the pure poetry of Leopold's writing, and some of the most, powerful passages when he shows, and this is probably what resonated most with me then, that one can be both a scientist and a poet. And in fact, the science feeds the poetry, and the poetry in its own way feeds the science. And of course, in college worlds and in life in general, we tend to separate these parts of the human way of communicating and understanding the world. So that Leopold's example of, again, a very thoughtful, deeply critical thinker could also turn to that other part of his brain and let the sense of wonder come forward, and how those together. And that was such an important contribution, not only obviously to a reader like me, but to the way we think about writing about the natural world. And it really did opened the doors to so many others who would come along after Leopold.
Your response there of the relationship between scientists and poets, it reminds me of something that I often said in my time as a literature professor, that scientists, poets, and farmers all start with really the same material, with observation, careful observation, and a willingness to ask new questions. In my own family, my sister is a biologist, geologist, and a GIS map maker. So she's in some ways much more qualified to do the work that I do today. But our collaborative spirit working together, me as a writer and her as a scientist, is we often help sharpen each other's questions and ideas and frameworks for understanding. So
it all comes down to storytelling, doesn't it? That was Leopold's gift, was to be able to take a science and translate it, if you will, into storytelling. And to go back to your question about what stands out when you read it today, often the thought I have on this is that Leopold's prose is so compelling, we sometimes forget that he was, especially in the first part of the book, writing about a really degraded landscape at the lowest point in its at least recent human history. And so sometimes we have to remind ourselves that Leopold is weaving these compelling and quite beautiful stories out of a place that was a mess. It's not John Muir in the Sierras. It's not, the grand landscapes of the American West or anything like that. It's a worn out piece of Wisconsin farmland. And yet out of that comes beauty and compelling thoughts.
I still have a house in a very beautiful part of Connecticut, right in a wilderness preserve, wildlife preserve on the northern border of Connecticut. And, I left that place where I was working closely with local farms, a beautiful CSA farm, and I came back to my roots, my hometown here in Park River, North Dakota. And, our ditches are filled with topsoil. We've got lots and lots of issues here in the Red River Valley related to conservation efforts. And so for me, finding inspiration, beauty, reason for hope is not only something that I think is important broadly in conservation, but it's something that we have to kind of dig deep for in places like this, where I do think that there is reason to hope, and there are a lot of things that are happening here that I'm encouraged by, but it's certainly not the beautiful New England woods. It's a different kind of landscape here.
Speaking of different kinds of landscapes, long before I was a conservationist, I was raised to be a bulldozer operator. My grandfather started a road building company soon after returning from the Pacific in World War II. During the war, he served as a forward observer, or the person responsible for calling in the coordinates of airstrikes. My grandfather earned this position for his uncanny ability to eyeball distances with precision across landscapes. It's something he picked up from his years as a North Dakota farm boy. I don't know what it's like to go to war, or what it's like to come home from one. Instead, like many rural youth, I left my home to get an education, to seek opportunity, to get out and stay gone. It took me nearly 20 years to come back home. When I was interviewed for my job as the soil conservation manager in my hometown, the supervisors asked what I hoped to see in 10 years. A homecoming, I said. There is something about Leopold's thinking like a mountain that reminds me of a war story and a kind of return home. As Leopold explains, quote, "In those days, we had never heard of passing up a chance to kill a wolf." For Leopold and his contemporaries, wolves were the enemy. And for much of the 19th and 20th century, America waged ecological war against its wolves. In one fateful moment, though, something changed in Leopold's mind. After he and his fellow hunters emptied their rifles with wild shots into a pack of wolves, Leopold writes, quote, "We reached the old wolf in time to watch a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. I realized then, and have known ever since, that there was something new to me in those eyes, something known only to her and to the mountain." Having once believed that fewer wolves meant more deer, and that no wolves would mean hunter's paradise, Leopold begins to question these deeply held beliefs, sensing that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view. Continue listening to learn more about the true story behind thinking like a mountain.
Of all of Leopold's writings, might be thinking like a mountain is the one that just kind of gets into the psyche of the reader and allows the reader to measure her or his own evolution, because that's what the essay was about. It was about Leopold's own changing of his own viewpoint, his worldview. Why it bears rereading and rereading and rereading is there's so much going on in this short little essay about scales of time and space, and thinking long term, and thinking about whole landscapes and ecosystems, thinking about human impacts and persecution of predators, and what that means, and how that way of thinking and conservation was outmoded even back then. And now we're still learning these lessons, of course, all these decades later. So there's just a lot wrapped up in a lot of layers to that essay. I think all of us have these moments of revelation or veils lifting from the way we see and understand our place in the world. And I suppose I can name a number of those, but the one that actually comes to mind is I spent a lot of time when I was growing up in the North Woods of northern Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And most of your listeners will probably know this history, that the complete deforestation by the settlers of the Upper Midwest to build the farms and barns and homes of the broad Midwest with the white pine timber. That episode was very key, obviously, in the development of the American conservation movement. So when I was just a young kid and experiencing these forests, which had grown up and returned second growth forests, I didn't know. I didn't know any of that backstory. And once I began to understand, oh my gosh, this place was a wasteland 60, 70 years before. And that's just one example. I'll mention another one related to this. Was one of those trips. I was heading north with my brother, actually. And I was just a kid. I must have been no more than 11 or 12. And we ended up camping of necessity because he had a van that kept breaking down. We ended up camping along the shores of the Wolf River on the Menominee Reservation. And anyone who knows this community in the Menominee tradition of stewardship, it's one of the more remarkable stories globally of forest stewardship and care. And to be able to wake up along the Wolf River and see white pines going 100 and 120 feet in the air with the sunlight streaming through them, it was just, you didn't have to be a forester or an ecologist to understand you were in a new, old place. In fact, for Leopold, it wasn't just shooting that wolf and then the eyes open. No, it took him a long time, and it was a series of mistakes he made and lessons he had to learn and new ideas he had to formulate and questioning himself and rethinking. And I guess we all do that. And then as a writer, he did decided he needed to distill that early episode down to the essay you read as Thinking Like a Mountain. This is what we do. We reflect on those moments when something that we don't quite understand at the moment allows us to rethink things and rethink who we are.
That's such a beautiful response. I'm struck by that imagery of sunlight bursting through the canopy of white pine forest, and then the revelation earlier in life of it being a second growth forest, and that kind of palimpsest of history that you see in such places. And one thing that really stood out to me in looking through your biography of Leopold is I think I have this right, that one of the discoveries was a letter to his mother from September 22nd, 1909, that it mentions the wolf hunt, but what takes a bigger priority in that letter is the losing of his pipe. And I guess I bring that to the listener's attention because for myself, I think this is also important. When we're talking about prairie restoration or ecological restoration, we're also talking about the speed with which the human mind can change. And I, as a teacher and a student, know myself how slow that process can be. And even for someone like Leopold, who writes about this moment, and the way that it's conveyed in that essay is that it's kind of, I reached the dying wolf in time to watch the fierce green fire dying in her eyes. It sounds like the moment happens immediately. But what you're able to flesh out in the biography, I think, so well is that moment actually takes time. And in your response, his student had to egg him on to tell that publicly. And so I don't know what to make of that other than even someone like Leopold, it takes time to change your mind on these issues.
Yeah, I have always interpreted that personally as the intuition of the lesson learned is there, but it takes time to realize that intuition in our rational brains. And you may have a feeling about, oh, something is different here, but you can't articulate it. You don't know how to process it. It takes a lifetime sometimes to do that.
I'm curious to hear your response to how we can shift from thinking like a mountain to thinking like a prairie.
Now that I think of it, that was another kind of thinking like a mountain moment when I first began to understand what a prairie is. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and a prairie was a vacant lot down across the street or wherever. It took me quite a while. Back then, in those days, we didn't have the type of programs to expose young people to natural history and science, and it just was not part of my curriculum at all. But it did not take long before I began to understand what a prairie was. And I can remember going to one protected little plot of prairie outside Chicago in what was then the far western suburbs and saying, oh man, this is different. Same experience as going to the Menominee Forest was one. And then in Green Fire, actually in the film, that we included this little bit about a little postage stamp prairie right near where I lived on Milwaukee Avenue. Those who know Chicago, up in the northwest suburbs, this is a little prairie called Wentworth Prairie, or also called Peacock Prairie. And it's one of the actually richest little remnant prairies left in Illinois. And it survived only because basically one person back in the 1960s learned about prairies and decided she was going to go to work. Bernice is her name, and she's still alive in her 90s now, and she still tells the story. Anyway, I began to understand that a prairie is more than just a plot of open space in the flat Midwest, that it was a thriving, diverse, deep-rooted, evolving, perennial community of plants and animals, soil and water and people, and that you cannot understand the evolution of our continental landscape over the last 25,000 years, including the long millennia of indigenous life and caretaking, unless you understand prairie. You can't understand agriculture unless you understand prairie. You can't understand the problems and challenges of modern industrial agriculture unless you understand prairie.
Understanding prairie takes all of us. In our next segment, Dr. Meine and I discuss his role as the on-screen guide for the Emmy Award-winning film Green Fire, and we pay tribute to Estella Leopold and N. Scott Momaday, both of whom died in 2024. As a former literature professor, let me give you all a reading assignment. At your next chance, read Momaday's The Way to Rainy Mountain, which is one of my all-time favorite books and one I often taught alongside A Sand County Almanac to help students develop a deeper understanding of land ethics from indigenous perspectives. The Way to Rainy Mountain is a journey narrative told in 3 braided voices, moving across oral tradition, historical narrative, and personal family stories. Momaday's The Way to Rainy Mountain is one I think of often, especially in today's episode, where we consider questions about how we can change our minds. Momaday often said he was a man made of words, and that stories had the power to shape and reshape our world.
The documentary film was the first modern documentary on Leopold's life and work, and I ended up in the film because the filmmakers felt that that was a necessary kind of narrative tool for filmmaking the film to have an on-screen narrator, so I ended up in that role. The challenge of the film was to not just do kind of a typical historical documentary biographical film, but and not just a dive into current contemporary conservation challenges, but to try to do something of a hybrid, to tell Leopold's story, but to make a point that the story didn't end with Leopold himself as an individual, but that it was in fact his family, his students, his colleagues, large community of readers, and really anyone who thinks and cares about land, our role in it, our relationships with it, our kinship with it. And so we interviewed a lot of people. Forget how many dozens, 80 or so, 80, 90 people we interviewed. And you never know what's going to come out at the end of a process like that. And my job was just to try not to embarrass myself, basically. But we did interview all of Leopold's surviving children at that point, the 3 siblings who were still alive of the 5. And Estella Leopold, the youngest of the 5, as you mentioned, she's just passed away a couple of weeks ago here now at the age of 97. And boy, to still have, when you look back on the film was done in 2011, completed, and you're doing a snapshot in time. And so the fact that we were able to capture some of these elders at a time when they were still able to share their stories was very meaningful. And with the children of Leopold, they're all 5 of these went on to remarkable careers in science and conservation and environmental activism. I'd say maybe the single most important thread in all of that is just like their father Aldo and their mother Estella, they were able to combine their intellectual achievement, which is prodigious, with this deep ethic of care as well. So those were not separate parts of life for the Leopold clan, to be able to think critically about the world and our role in it, but also to realize we have an ethical, moral relationship to the world around us. And sometimes those things don't go easily together. In fact, there's some who say you shouldn't, as a scientist, show your heart because that will bias you, that sort of view. Well, that Leopold never adhered to that view, and neither did his children. And so they all exemplified this family, this ethic that grows out of a very close family relationship. And the more you learn about the Leopold family as they were growing up, you see what a remarkable, warm, respecting family they were, and how deeply devoted they were to the good life, as one of my colleagues calls it, coming out of the New Mexican Hispanic tradition of Estella Leopold. This just approach to making the most of life and understand it's this celebration, right? And that connects us with the Scott Momaday story. So I, like you, I guess, Josh, had been influenced by Scott Momaday's work going back decades. I read The Way to Rainy Mountain. I must have read in college, way back. And he was sort of my introduction, I would say, I guess, to Native American literature in general, because from there I went on to read and continue to read a lot of the writers that have really helped shape me and my views. And so we were toward the end of the film, actually, and we were almost done with interviews because we'd already been working for years. But I had a nagging doubt in my head on this, not especially since I'm on screen now in this narrator role, and I'm like, something's missing here. We need an indigenous voice. And the first person I could think of was Scott Momaday, who was living in Santa Fe at the time, where Leopold's wife was from, where he lived, he knew that area in his early life in New Mexico. So anyway, through some fortuitous connections in literary and conservation world, we were able to extend an invitation, and Mr. Momaday said, I'd love to talk. And we ended up spending a morning interviewing him, and it was, oh gosh, for me, that was a peak experience. That was just totally apart from the filmmaking, the opportunity to visit with and have a quiet, thoughtful conversation with this deep, as one of my friends called him, and this fellow who has a very advanced soul.
The broader expanse of North Dakota features Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, Mandan, Arikara, Hidatsa. Just across the border in Canada, we have the Métis. There's lots and lots of Indigenous presence here, not just Indigenous past, but Indigenous presence. And I very much would not be doing this work. I attributed a lot of what I do to Aldo Leopold's influence and inspiration, but also to the work that Native and Indigenous teachers have offered me as a non-Native person. One thing that stands out is my Dakota language teacher. His name was Dr. Clifford Chonku, or Matoa-Takbe, which means charging bear in Dakota. He was the first person to teach me Mitakuye Owasin, which is all my relations. Mm-hmm. And it's a way of recognizing relationship between not just human relations, not just genealogical relations, family, clan, tribe, or nation, but also of recognizing relationship with other species, and setting the human as a younger sibling to all of these older beings, as well as recognizing that the individual is inseparable from the collective relationship, that reciprocal relationship. So I'm just curious to hear from you about your experiences working with tribal partners, tribal nations, and what that influence has had on your work.
Personally, I have benefited so much from being able to connect to varying degrees with members of different nations. You mentioned a little bit of work with the Ojibwe bands here in Wisconsin, a little bit with the Cree in Canada, but most particularly, and for me most directly because I'm here, is with the Ho-Chunk Nation, and I am speaking from traditional Ho-Chunk homeland here. And without going into excruciating detail on this for, 25 years now, been working with the Ho-Chunk Nation on helping to reclaim some of their ancestral land here. This is related to a former military facility just a few miles from where I'm sitting right now, and working with the tribe on prairie restoration, actually, of the Sauk Prairie here along the Wisconsin River. And I am in a landscape that bears that history, the painful history of loss and alienation. Right up, if I turn my shoulder to the right, as I'm doing right now, I'm looking up to what we call around here Black Hawk Ridge, which is the site where Chief Black Hawk in 1832 led his people across the Wisconsin River, ultimately to a tragic end out on the Mississippi River. But so this landscape is burdened with that history, as all places are burdened with difficult, tragic histories. And so we're at this moment when we're trying to understand these legacies of settler colonialism and understand what they mean for caretaking of the land. As you mentioned, there's a lot of resonance between a Leopold land ethic. I tend not to say Leopold's land ethic because he himself understood it was not just an individual, but a community who produces an ethic. So there's a lot of resonance between the tradition that Leopold represents of land ethics in Western culture, with indigenous traditions, not only here in Turtle Island, but around the world. And yet we also have to be extremely careful about not conflating these different approaches to ethics. We have to be respectful of the differences and understand they're coming from very different places, literally, and different cultural traditions and worldviews. And so other scholars, I'm thinking particularly right now of Kyle White, a leading environmental justice scholar who's Citizen Potawatomi member, has written about this, about there may be potential for these kind of different channels of ethical approaches to interact in a positive way, but we also have to be careful about too quickly trying to do that without understanding these histories and traditions. But we are in this moment of really interesting new ways and approaches and collaborations that are happening. Again, I had that opportunity here, and to me, it just flows from what, I'm partly a Leopold scholar, but I'm also a conservation biologist, and that draws on the history, but that's much more about working on the landscapes now that we inhabit. And so for me here locally, that means, devoting myself to creating a relationship with my friends and neighbors in Ho-Chunk Nation. And that to me is the most important thing of all. This is all about long-term relationships.
It strikes me how much of ecological restoration work, land restoration work, Robin Wall Kimmerer, the Potawatomi writer of Braiding Sweetgrass and Gathering Moss, she notes, that the first step in ecological restoration is a restoring of our relationships to land. And she's actually drawing from Gary Paul Nabhan, who says that as well.
I have to interrupt you because both of those are two really close old friends of mine, and I owe them both so much in helping orient me to this too. Those are two of my favorite human beings of any time, anyway.
Yeah, no, I believe it. I've been heavily influenced by both of them in their writing and their work, and that is kind of an amazing capacity of writing. I have actually not met either of them in person, but it's maybe presumptuous of me to say, but they feel like friends as through the writing and that relationship building. So what I have come to realize in my own efforts here locally, that I buy what Robin Wall Kimmerer says and Gary Paul Nabhan says about ecological restoration coming out of a restoring of our relationship with land. And right in that is also telling me that it's about building relationships. And that is a really crucial and difficult and lifelong pursuit that isn't a one and done thing, as you're saying about land acknowledgement. It's largely about building long, ongoing, reciprocal relations. And that's before we get to restoration, or while we're working on restoration. And in a time of political cultural urgency, that kind of patience for relationship building seems like it can be a challenge in and of itself. But this brings me, I guess, to the thing that you wrote in the 2010 preface to the reissue of the bio on Aldo Leopold, where you said that you were struck by Leopold's, quote, lifelong search for common ground in conservation. Since we are on Common Ground, a Prairie podcast, I'm curious what you think Leopold's search for common ground was, and what does that look like, and what does that look like for the foundation today?
Well, again, Leopold, what makes his life interesting and compelling is that he was always growing from his youth until the day he passed. Leopold of 1923 was not the same as Leopold of 1933 or 1943 or 1948, right up until the very end. He is constantly challenging himself to think, and this is one of the great themes in Leopold's trajectory, is sort of the small p politics of conservation, if you will, by which I don't mean partisan parties and everything. I just mean how we think of ourselves in relation to one another and how we govern ourselves. So he was a product of that early conservation movement of Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, and that was all about, we're going to train up these experts and send them out to the land, and they're going to manage a land with the best science, and that will solve all our problems. Well, did not take long for Leopold in his day-to-day work life and personal life and intellectual growth to understand that that was not going to be a viable solution everywhere for every problem. And so it did not, very soon he began to start thinking about, well, the reality is on the land, we share landscapes. And if we want to achieve, even on large public lands out west, you're still dealing with human connections and relationships in the land, including the historical connections with the tribal nations. He did not know that at the time, and he would never fully learn that perhaps, but that's our job. In any case, probably the most significant thread of this in Leopold's work is his interest in watersheds, right? And how very early on, observing changes in the southwestern landscape, he began to pay attention to soil erosion and degradation of watershed function. And water is the great connector. Geographically, spiritually, and emotionally, water is life. Water connects us all. And so if you're thinking in terms of watersheds, you're thinking in terms of connectivity in the landscape. And you cannot solve problems of watershed degradation simply by dealing one-on-one with the individuals in a watershed. You have to be thinking at that larger scale about the shared common ground of a watershed. So he takes that from the Southwest, and when he returns to the Midwest, to Wisconsin, and begins to devote himself to this largely agricultural landscape of the upper Midwest, that really begins to affect his way of thinking about conservation. There were specific episodes along the way here that I don't need to go into, I suppose, but the one I would mention is really the innovative work done at a small watershed along the Mississippi River called Coon Creek Watershed, Coon Valley, which Leopold went to work on, and it was the nation's first watershed restoration demonstration project, started by what would soon be the Soil Conservation Service. And that meant if you're going to solve this problem of incredibly destructive flooding and soil loss, you're going to have to get hundreds of people to work together. So in fact, more than 500 farmers in that watershed signed up, and it is one of the great stories, not so well known, but one of the great stories in conservation of the beginning of thinking about watersheds. And that's just, again, symbolic of the larger issues. We share the commons of lots of things, not just water, wildlife, soil, forests, prairies, all the great common resources, the air and the water and the soil, as well as the inherited cultural values. And so Leopold begins to rethink that top-down, experts from the government and Yale University, in his case, going out to thinking much more about citizen involvement, of public participation, of communal values. So sometimes when I get on this theme, I pull out a line that I once used in a talk, and the line was, we can dwell on all those things that divide us, and we certainly do that these days, but we all dwell within landscapes that connect us.
I've always been struck by the way A Sand County Almanac is structured, the way it follows the cycles of the seasons, the tracks of skunks and mice through the snow, the way it tracks time with a saw blade and the rings of an oak tree that Leopold recounts 1 year at a time, backwards, until before the Civil War. In our next short segment, I ask Dr. Meine to share his thoughts on how Leopold structured the book, and to ask how the structure of the book can change our approach to education, especially ecological education.
Those are expansive questions, so I'll do my best here. Well, it goes back to what we were saying earlier about the power of storytelling. Leopold in Sand County Almanac is very consciously telling stories about his local land community, to use his phrase, and what he sees in it and understands about it, and what he still is ignorant of. Very big on ignorance, actually. When you read Leopold, he says a lot about not knowing enough about this or that. But what he's doing is helping the reader to see through the eyes of an ecologist. or naturalist. And remember, the word ecology was not well known in Leopold's day. He was teaching at the University of Wisconsin and beginning to share those lessons with students and to say, well, this is how land works, and this is our role within it, and this is how it changes, and this is these are the layers of history that we need to think about. So he is helping the reader to see the world as an ecologist sees it. And because he felt that was essential not only as a conservationist, but as a citizen, as a member of a society, as a member of a human community, we needed this knowledge and this way of understanding. And it's all about connectivity. It's all about process and connectivity and functions and flows in the landscape and connections across time and space. I mean, they don't use those words. That's what stories do. They don't use those words. They tell stories so that these complex realities can embed in us in a different way. This is exactly the same thing that Scott Momenday did, or that Robin Wall Kimmerer has done, or that Gary Paul Nabhan, to cite some of the other writers we talked about. This is their mode of sharing this way of seeing the world. And what makes it important in terms of education is we set up our educational institutions and curricula in ways that separate all these different fields of knowledge and all these different ways of, the sciences and the humanities, and you're an English major and I'm a biology major and blah, blah, blah. But it's all, and as Leopold said, once you step outside the classroom, it's all connected. So this is why ecology was once labeled the subversive science, because it subverted the notion that the way we advance in our rational way of understanding the world is by dividing things up and looking at smaller and smaller and smaller pieces of them, reductionism, to use the formal term. Leopold, however, is an integrated thinker, an interdisciplinary thinker. So to solve any problem, we know we can't think in the same way that created the problem. And so we have to be able to think across disciplines. We have to be able to understand and feel the connections. And this was Leopold's mode of teaching. It was his way of telling his stories. And it's one we've known about for a long time. Maybe we've known it forever, actually. But we create the institutions and the disciplines and the fields and the that continue to say, I study this and you study that, and well, see you later. But we now know that any problem at any scale requires us to make connections and to honor those connections. So in Sand County Almanac, another structural angle on Sand County is he starts out with really basic stories of the plants and animals in his local landscape. And then he goes to a little broader geography and talks about lessons he's learned, sometimes painfully, in his own career and life. And then at the end, he goes into these very expansive ways of considering the philosophical and ethical complexities of our human-land relations. And so that going from the very particular, local, intimate to the global and conceptual, that's another trajectory. And even he says, only the most sympathetic readers may want to wrestle with these essays at the end of the book. But he leads you there, and this is what he did with his own students. But fundamental to all this was understanding the life around you. And so one of my more favorite quotes of Leopold's actually is from a lecture to his students at the very end of his life. And I can't quote it word for word, but the gist of it was, once you learn, I'm trying to teach you to read the land, to read the plants and animals, soil and waters. And once you learn to read the land, I have no fear what you will do to it or with it. And I know many pleasant things it will do to you. So this wasn't only about problem solving and practical applications. It was about maximizing our appreciation of the beauty and wonder and fascinating realities of the world around us.
When I think about this same question now in my role with Soil Conservation District, I can't let go of the teacher in me, and yet I'm finding more and more that when I take my young crew, we've had high school interns work with us. We've had college students return and come back and work with us in the last year that I've been back in this role. And increasingly, I find that my role is really to get them to the Prairie pothole region, or to get them to the Prairie, and that the Prairie, the rivers, the Prairie potholes, they do a lot of the teaching for me. The birds on the landscape. It's more very similar to the way that A Sand County Almanac is structured, as a kind of journey following tracks into the woods that ends up getting you deeper and deeper into those questions until we're at the land ethic and we're really deep in these kinds of questions. And similar to Mamaday's The Way to Rainy Mountain, which is a journey narrative pursuing and getting closer and closer to this ancestral homeland place. And so thinking about the role of teacher as being almost flipped has been really important to me, and my understanding that I'm not teaching about the land is the teacher, and we're going out to gather a lesson, collect a lesson in some ways.
In The Land Ethic, perhaps Leopold's most ambitious and most significant essay in the collection, he notes that a land ethic is always the responsibility of a thinking community. He also directly describes the role of soil conservation districts, which at the time of his writing had only been around for about 10 years. As Leopold said, "The district is a beautiful piece of social machinery, but it is coughing along on two cylinders because we have been too timid and too anxious for quick success to tell the farmer the true magnitude of his obligations. Obligations have no meaning without conscience, and the problem we face is the extension of the social conscience from people to land. No important change in ethics was ever accomplished without an internal change in our intellectual emphasis, loyalties, affections, and convictions. In our attempt to make conservation easy, we have made it trivial." In our final segment, I asked Dr. Meine about this passage to help us better understand what Leopold meant by the land ethic and the roles and responsibilities we play as a thinking community, and the larger structural issues we must face in community conservation work.
I mean, this was amazingly ambitious, a piece of policy work going on. And Leopold was he is fascinating on this. He's always both supportive and critical of policy changes. Sometimes he's pushing them himself, but he's always aware that government programs can only do so much when it came, in this case, to private landowners and farmers in their stewardship responsibilities. But what he's, I think, really saying in that passage is, conservation can be construed as simply long-term self-interest. The assurance of continued income, wealth and health and prosperity, et cetera, that's one way of thinking about conservation. But he wasn't satisfied with that. He said, no, this is much more. It's a much more deeper, fundamental reality. Conservation asks us to revisit not just what's good for us in the shorter, maybe little longer term, but in fact, it's all about human relationships with one another and with the land, and the deeper structural realities and forces that put us in these positions that are at the root of, no pun intended, things like soil loss in agricultural landscapes. So he's as he often is pushing us, pushing conservationists, most especially his own colleagues and his own contemporaries, not to be satisfied with superficial, self-interested progress in conservation, but to really think about what we would now, what terms we use now are sustainability or resilience, the other terms we now have used to try to capture those more expansive aims of conservation. And that may mean rethinking the way we even consider what agriculture is in the upper Midwest. We have lived under a model for 150 years, which is not very long in the big long scheme of things. In North Dakota, it's probably been where are we, 2023? 130 or so growing seasons
Right.
Leave it
Yeah.
that way. What's it going to look like in 130 more growing seasons? Well, if you really want to start wrestling with those questions, if you have the courage to do it, you're going to have to start thinking more about the larger structural issues.
We at Common Ground, a Prairie podcast, would like to thank Dr. Curt Meine for taking the time to talk with us today. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thanks also to Krista Fiala, a former student of mine who was recently accepted to Dartmouth Graduate School. She was the sound editor on today's episode. Stay tuned to episode 4 of Common Ground, a Prairie podcast, which will feature interviews with farmers and soil health experts in North Dakota working on efforts to preserve and regenerate our soil. Before we go, take a final listen to Dr. Curt Meine describing Leopold's idea of a thinking community and our collective responsibilities to contribute to an ever-evolving land ethic for our time. We encourage our listeners to pick up copies of A Sand County Almanac and The Way to Rainy Mountain. Watch the documentary film Green Fire, Aldo Leopold and a Land Ethic for Our Time. Please share your stories about the events that shaped your own understanding of land ethics with us by commenting on this episode on our YouTube channel or Spotify page, or by writing to me at josh@walshcounty1938.com. Until next time, this is Josh Anderson signing off for Common Ground, a Prairie podcast. Dr. Curt Meine will take us out.
In the land ethic, at the very end of it, he makes a point that this ethic of care is not the product of an individual, even himself, that it is always evolving in the, as he says, the minds of a thinking community. And it's our job to keep that thinking community open-minded, open-hearted, and to welcome all into the conversation and to see where we can make our own contribution.
Common Ground, a Prairie podcast, is supported by a generous grant from the North Dakota Natural Resources Trust. If you would like to contribute to our on-the-ground conservation initiatives and our conservation internship and mentorship programs here in North Dakota, please consider making a donation to us through our member support link on our Spotify page. Your contributions will directly support the Walsh County Three Rivers Soil Conservation District, where this year we will plant over 10,000 trees and several hundred acres of conservation grass, pollinators, and cover crops, while also offering hands-on conservation job training to our high school and college interns. You can also support our efforts by liking, reviewing, sharing, and subscribing to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. Thank you.